This is TruthQuest, uncovering the powerful technologies, visionary strategies, and compelling stories that fuel our quest for clarity and authenticity in a rapidly changing world. From groundbreaking innovations to real-life success stories, we take a deep dive into how individuals and businesses are harnessing truth tech to change their lives and create meaningful change. We believe that everyone deserves to know the truth. This is TruthQuest. And now your hosts, Dr. Bryan and Mary Claire.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Bryan.
And I'm Mary Claire.
And we are your hosts for TruthQuest, where we dive into the new technologies and stories about people's quest for truth and the impact it has on their lives. We're excited today to talk with Russ Warner, who is with Converus. And let me give you a little background on Converus as we get started. This is a company that was started about 12 years ago from a technology from the University of Utah that has completely revolutionized the way that we do truth verification, giving us completely new technologies and ways to integrate AI, machine learning, and other new technologies to determining whether people are telling the truth. And as we've said before on this podcast, everybody needs to know the truth. And the whole point of this is to find a way that we can do so easily and inexpensively and in ways that help us move forward in our lives. So, Mary Claire, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, Russ. So excited to have you on. Russ Warner has an extensive 35-year career in technology companies. He is an expert in ocular motor deception testing and has written thousands of screening and diagnostic tests, trained polygraph examiners, government and law enforcement personnel in 36 countries, and consulted as a subject matter expert in legal proceedings. He is a science and technology member of the APA. He holds an MBA from Brigham Young University and teaches business courses as an adjunct professor at 3 universities. Russ, it is a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Mary Claire. It'll be great. This will be fun.
It will. I've had so much fun getting to know you and learning from your expertise. For a man that's been writing true and false statements for years, I often wonder, does Russ only think in true and false statements? So great to have you on. Russ, what we want to do is, and we do this with all our guests, would love to hear a little bit about your story, your background, what brought you to Converus, and then we'll jump into Converus's history a little bit more. But let's start with you. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Okay, well, thanks. And true statements. Yeah, true. I've only worked in software companies for my entire career. And during that career, I've took some time to work in Latin America quite a bit, just because I spoke Spanish, and it was a characteristic. It was a talent that lots of people don't have. So over time, I learned to work in Latin America in various countries. I've also expanded into other geographies, but because of my Spanish-speaking skills and my software skills, I was recruited by the CEO of Converus because originally we were launching the product in Mexico and in Latin America, and he needed some help operationally, sales, marketing. I have done quite a few different things. So it was basically an invitation to join the team on a new technology that was going to be very disruptive, very innovative. And I thought, why not?
Game on. So prior to joining Converus, did you have any experience in the truth verification, lie detection industry?
Nada, nothing, zero. Nope, nothing. I had no clue. I'd watch movies like all of you, where you see the polygraph being pulled out in a comical way, sometimes in a cold case documentary, but I really had no idea as to how it worked.
Okay, so then when in joining, we'll get into the history of Converus here, but a little bit more, I have a question on you and how you became such an expert on true false statements and writing tests and all good things. Tell us a little bit about that journey, and I'm sure you're working directly with the scientists behind ocular motor deception testing, but yeah, what's your path been on becoming such an expert in this space?
You remember how when you would sit down at your grandparents' feet and they'd tell you how they walked uphill both ways to school and this really hard. That's what it was like in the early days of creating truth verification tests, because the scientists at University of Utah are brilliant, but they didn't think about user interface, software, things easier. So in the beginning, I was trained by them to write these tests, and there was no one else in the company that could do it. We were a small startup, and they gave me spreadsheets, and spreadsheets had hundreds of rows of true and false statements, cryptic looking, and I'd have to go through and come up with creative ways to explain to the person who would sit down in front of a computer and either hear this information or read it and try to clarify what this test is going to be about. And then to follow all the protocols that they had developed. In the early days, it was we'd have 4 questions on the test. Questions could be something like drug use or bribery or stealing information or stealing from the company. Whatever the questions were, I'd have to come up with 12 variations of each question. 6 true variations and 6 false variations. And so every single test I'd have to write 12 times 4, so 48 variations of the same questions. And over time, after I've done maybe 2,000 tests like that, I figure I've probably written or reviewed more than 500,000, seriously.
Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness.
500,000, that you'll get good at doing this if you do it 500,000 times.
Which is why I asked, a number of months ago, Russ, do you only think in terms of true false statements? I could not believe the background there. Okay, yeah. Let's pull that into the evolution of Converus over the last number of years. If that was the beginning, let's do kind of a beginning, middle, end, and how AI became a part of the solution. Would just love to hear a little bit more, tell our listeners a little bit more about the background of Converus and how we've gotten to today.
Yeah, and tell us the story about how it developed as well, Russ, from the University of Utah, kind of how it got started in the markets and why, and a little bit about its progress, maybe some of the hurdles and challenges you've run into as well.
To make this even more interesting, let me tell you a bit about the industry, because there were lots of different ways up to the 1920s for cultures or groups to try to determine deception. In fact, I remember reading about, I think it was in Asia somewhere, where they would give you a saltine cracker and make you eat the saltine cracker very quickly and then ask you a question. And if you're lying, they posited that your mouth would be dry and it would be difficult to eat a saltine and then answer the question. I mean, we've evolved from that. Yeah, that's a true story. To the 1920s, there was a medical student, part-time cop in Berkeley or I can't remember, in California. And he devised this thing called the polygraph. It was a way to measure certain physiological behaviors, and he tied that to deception. So your heart rate, your blood pressure, the temperature and humidity of your skin, your respiration. And so this device, the polygraph, it was an analog device, meaning it was a box with paper that would scroll across the top. These little needles would scratch in the measurements of your heart rate and your blood pressure and your respiration. And it wasn't really adopted by the community, the law enforcement community, till about the late 30s, when the FBI adopted the polygraph to be used to test its own employees. It wasn't used in the beginning to test, suspects in a crime. It was employee monitoring. And for 70 years, that analog box was the thing, the go-to. In lab studies, it showed greater than 80% accuracy in some cases, and the federal government in the US determined 80% is kind of the gold standard. You got to get above 80, close to or above 80. It wasn't until the early 90s that doctors David Raskin and John Kircher, who were polygraph experts. In fact, David Raskin was the one to have conducted a polygraph on this guy named Ted Bundy, who was.
I didn't know that.
David tested Ted Bundy. I won't tell you the results of the test, but it doesn't matter at this point. He didn't do well. Let's just say that. But David and John were approached by a company that made polygraphs and said, "Hey, we need to modernize." So they worked with Stolting, was the name of the company, to digitalize or make software to take this polygraph from a metal box to software based. And at the same time, John Kircher, who was a statistician, developed these scoring algorithms. It's easier to score a test with an algorithm than it is to sit there and hand score. Ask any teacher who would you rather have a system score your quizzes or have, do it yourself? No one wants to do it themselves. Right. But they knew after decades of research that there were some inherent problems with polygraph. If someone is anxious or nervous, that can impact the results. And in fact, it would impact your heart rate, of course, your blood pressure. So nervousness and anxiety. So about 10 years later, in the early 2000s, John and one of his co-workers, well, a PhD at the University of Utah, Doug Hacker, decided to go on a climb. They were hiking in Washington. They invited one of their friends who was a CIA federal polygraph examiner, and they were just chit-chatting as they hiked up the mountain. It sounds like a bunch of nerds because they're talking about how to improve their jobs by hiking. And they came up with an idea, and the idea was based, I believe, and I don't know the exact story, but one of them had looked at some research that showed that when college students were given math problems, they noticed that their pupils would dilate when answering the question. And the more complex the math problem, the more dilation. So 1 + 1 = 2 did cause dilation of the pupils, but 10 times 10, which is more complex, caused a variation in that dilation. It was more significant. With that in mind, and with an idea as to, well, could lying be perceived as something that would create a change in your cognitive load? Is it harder to lie than tell the truth? And they'd read some other work that said, yeah, it is harder to lie because you have to create a story that doesn't exist. You have to come up with details and then keep it straight, keep it logical in your mind. Because if you're being interrogated or interviewed, you have to make sure you don't stumble over your details. It makes it look like you don't know what you're talking about. And you have to self-monitor. If someone's watching you as you speak, you're looking at, okay, I better not, move my hands too much. I better look at them in the eye.
Yeah.
So self-monitoring, creating a story on the fly, all of that creates additional cognitive effort. And that makes your pupil diameter change. And then they involved a couple of other PhDs at the University of Utah, one who had done a lot of work on reading behaviors. And polygraph was really more like a dialogue between two people. I'm sitting there, the examiner's asking me questions, we're talking. They determined that if you could administer a test with a computer, so there's no talking, you're reading, they found that there were reading behaviors that were diagnostic of deception. So not only is it more difficult to tell a story cognitively, it is also interesting. These involuntary changes occur when you're lying, when you're reading, and you're going to answer a question to which you're going to lie. So if the question we're going to ask you, and let's suppose you're a bank robber, and the question asks you if you robbed a bank, while you were reading, your behaviors would change versus if they ask you if you did something that you didn't do or hadn't done.
Yeah.
So this is in the early 2000s. They came up with these ideas, and they tried a few studies and experiments, and they actually worked. They tried a few more, and they worked. And that was kind of the beginning, the genesis of this new ocular motor deception test.
So then combining thank you. That was fascinating. I knew parts of that story, but some of those details, this is an ever, for me, I continue to learn. I've said that from the get-go of this podcast. So one, thank you. Two, so that gets us to the science. And I came out of the University of Utah. It was in commercial. At this point, we're at the phase where, hey, we could take this to market. And I'm assuming you mentioned earlier in the story, David was asked to work on some algorithms from the kind of digitization of the polygraph. I presume those same algorithms potentially were the genesis of what then became the scoring mechanisms for ocular motor deception test, or am I totally wrong? I'm taking a guess here.
False.
Yes. All right. See, guys, I keep learning.
So before I forget that, the reason that the test asks true and false rather than yes and no is because everyone knows how to answer yes and no questions. And we're familiar because of school with true and false. And so false causes a bit more mental effort to answer the question, and that's intentional.
Yeah.
And it was John, not David. John is the statistician. John loves numbers, and he created these algorithms in the early 90s for polygraph and just took his work forward because they knew that, well, let me back up and say that one of the PhDs on the team, Ann Cook, was an expert in reading, and she started to use these infrared eye trackers. You actually strapped them on your head like a pair of glasses. This is early 2000, and they were monitoring the pupil changes in reading, pupil movements, reading behaviors with these early days infrared monitor eye trackers. And they found that if you measure these changes are so small,
Yeah.
you'd have to use a very high-speed camera, and there are thousands of changes in a few seconds, really. And so there was no way a person could sit down and look at this data and analyze it and score it.
Okay.
It was impossible.
Yeah.
So they had to come up with algorithms to score this information. It's not
Okay.
like watching an EKG. If you've ever been to a hospital, you've seen an EKG, you've seen the
Mhm.
blood, the heart rate bounce around on the screen. It's not like that. If you look at the data, it looks like a bunch of GPS coordinates, literally the left, right, up, down, back, forth movement of the eyes,
Yeah.
60 times a second. I pulled open one of the data files the other day, and it's had like 47,000 rows
Oh
and
my gosh.
20 columns wide of data.
Yeah.
So you're talking about 500,000 data points. You couldn't do it without an algorithm. So algorithms were critical and vital and important. And
Russ, if you could comment on that, that's super interesting because, and we've talked about this earlier on other podcasts, but there's a difference between a human evaluator and an algorithmic evaluator, right? I mean, given the number of data points, which should make us actually feel more comfortable because more data, as everybody knows, the more data you get, the more accurate you can get. But you said you needed to have a computer do that scoring, but talk about why you would also want a computer to do that scoring.
good point, good question. And that's really to avoid bias, really, and error, human error. Fatigue enters in if the examiner's scoring your test and they're tired or they're not concerned with your well-being, or they're being bribed. There are lots of reasons why you don't want
Oh,
a person. And I say that because in other countries and in the U.S. there's corruption in
Sure.
some cases. So you don't want a person with bias and fatigue and potentially corrupt reasons to score your test. And so that makes, in fact, we recently, about 2 years ago, I trained a group in another country, and a member of the U.S. Embassy came over to see what was going on. And they said, you know what? The reason I like this over the other thing that they were doing at the time is that it's scored by algorithm.
hmm.
You can't
Yeah.
corrupt an algorithm. You can't
No.
corrupt a computer. And so, and the other interesting thing is, in the early days when they started doing these experiments, they had to come up with a protocol or a way to test people. How long should we test them? How many questions should we ask? What kinds of questions should we ask? How can we mimic deceptive behavior in a lab study? I mean, all of these things, and these weren't newbie scientists, they had done lab experiments, but they came up with a way to measure deception with the eyes, and then they got certain results. And although the results were good, they thought we can do better. So every time they made a slight change, and you can only change really one thing at a time in your experiment,
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
so you know if it had a cause and effect or not. It took 10 years. So Mary Claire said, "Oh, so no, it took 10 years to finally get to the point where they said, let's publish." And professors aren't really concerned about taking products to market.
No.
They're more concerned about publishing because it changes their tenure, it gives them promotions. So publishing is where it's all about. And it wasn't until maybe 12 years later that someone said, "Hey, why don't we sell this?" And I think Bryan knows much more about this than I do, but they're a technology, what do you call the group in a university who sells or
Yeah, it's
licenses
usually the commercialization
Commercialization.
office. Yeah, the technology transfer commercialization
technology
office.
transfer? And so some investors got wind of what this could do and licensed the technology from the University of Utah to form a company.
Okay.
So until that point, there really was no commercial, I guess, sales motivation for the scientists. They were concerned about the science.
It's interesting. This is a technology that could radically change the world in so many different ways. And to your point, Russ, this was not a flash in the pan overnight. This took a lot of time and a lot of attention and a lot of focus from a lot of different disciplines and areas: psychology, statistics, math. The polygraph side of things. There's a lot that went into this, and then we have this transfer point at which Converus is formed. It then licenses the technology, and now we're on a commercial journey. Tell us a little bit about that. What does that look like? Because you've been there pretty much since the beginning.
I have, yes. And then in the beginning, the science team had created one protocol to do things, and the test would allow you to ask one question and ask a comparison question. the whole concept behind lie detection is you need to know how a person's body reacts or mind or eyes react when you know they're telling the truth. Because if you know what they look like when they're telling the truth, then if something changes, okay, maybe this other question is causing a reaction because they're not telling the truth. So early days, they had one protocol. You could ask one question with one comparison. And we thought, great, we're ready to go. And I remember, I won't say which of the scientists said, I think with this protocol, if we create maybe 10 tests, we'll cover all the needs of all companies worldwide.
That's like Thomas Watson at IBM saying, oh, there might be 7 or 8 computers in the whole world.
Exactly. So we decided to take the product to market in Mexico because in the United States, the use of lie detectors is controlled by law. You cannot, and since 1988, there's been a law in place called the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, EPPA. 1988, we can thank Orrin Hatch and Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts for that law. And that's basically says you cannot use a lie detector to test private company employees. You can test government employees, but not private company employees. Because there was because at the time it was polygraph. And polygraph was hand scored by a person. And there were cases of corruption, of bad tests, shoddy experiments, shoddy methods. The polygraph should be an hour-and-a-half test, and the examiners were doing them in 30 minutes. There was it was running amok. And this is in the late 70s. Polygraph examiners there were a few, would drive around in a van and go up to a mall and walk into the jewelry store of the mall. Back then, could have been Zales, something like that. Ask the manager, hey, do you think your employees steal from you? Oh, I don't know. Would you like to know?
Oh, man.
Sure. Let's go out to my van in the parking lot and let's do some testing. And so it really was unregulated in Wild West. And my understanding is the government said to the Polygraph Association, hey, you better control this. You better put some policies, procedures in place. And they said no, or they didn't do it fast enough. So wait for government, and regulation occurred. And then the law became law in 1988. And since then, so it's been more than 30 years, you've got a mentality in the U.S. where lie detectors are only used for criminal investigations.
Yeah.
But outside the U.S., lie detectors are used for pre-employment screening. And I would say the majority of the tests that are done using our technology are pre-employment screening, except in the U.S. And in the U.S., it's only valid with law enforcement agencies. So we primarily sell to police departments and sheriff's offices in the U.S. But that law doesn't inhibit you from running a lie detector for an infidelity test. It doesn't prohibit doing a drug test. We've even participated in a bass fishing tournament because sometimes fishermen lie. And so they test the winners of the contest to make sure they follow the rules of the contest. Criminal investigations, I do probably, if pre-employment screening is the most used
Common use case
for our product, then I would say investigations are second most. Hope I answered your question. Did that help?
Yeah.
No, that's very interesting. So let's transition. Let's talk about the different kinds of lie detections. You just told us all about ocular motor deception. There are a number of others, right? You talked about the polygraph, but we also have some of these, voice stress. There's a number of others, AI facial recognition, all the way through to fMRI types of, options. Talk a little bit about pros and cons of those.
Some organizations rely on interviews to determine if you're lying because they don't want to spend the time and effort to do more than that. Research shows that if a person sits behind the desk in front of another person and tries to determine if they're lying or telling the truth, you'll be about 54% accurate at determining deception. And with training, you might be able to bump that up to maybe 60 or 65%. So most people, although we might feel we're good at it, don't do a good job detecting deception. And all of the things you've heard about, like, the guy was lying to me because he looked in the upper right corner of the
or looked down at the floor or something.
Fidgeted none of that. None of those are real good indicators of deception. So then companies, organizations started using other things, integrity tests, where you're asked, and these are used a lot in the US because you can't use a polygraph or not a lie detector. Integrity tests will ask you, if you're put in this situation, what would you do? If your boss in a new job asked you to help steal, would you do it? Integrity tests kind of pose hypothetical situations and get you to indicate what your intention might be. But the problem with intentions is that you can always think about something and never do it. And your
Yeah.
opinion about something can change whether you're feeling good or not. So integrity tests, although they're still used worldwide, and it's a huge industry,
Oh,
they're
man.
not good indicators of deception, and they're not great indicators of future behavior. The best indicator of future behavior is past behavior.
That's right.
So if you want to ask a person, what have you done in the past? That's a much better indicator, because I think people repeat their same habits and behaviors, I don't know, 85% of the time. Some organizations use personality tests, and the only thing that does for you is determine if you're a good fit for the culture.
Yeah.
Personality has nothing to do with deception. Some companies use aptitude tests, and that only determines if you can do the job or not. Can you type 75 words a minute? Aptitude. So then we move on to polygraph, which we're familiar with. 100 years. It's 101 years old, 102 years old now. In a couple decades ago, another solution came out called the voice stress analyzer. The data shows that it's not that great in terms of accuracy. It's probably 65% accurate in best case. Although I think thousands of law enforcement agencies
What?
in the US use it.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to that because it kind of blows my mind. The more
I'll
I've
tell
dug
you
into
why
that,
they
we'll
use
come
it.
back to it.
If you can get them to honestly tell you why they use it, it's theater. It's the person that you just strapped on this equipment doesn't know if they're doing well or not, but you can tell them they are or not. So it's used as a prop to extract usually confessions or details, because when a person sits in front of a computer, they think they're had, they think they're caught.
Yeah.
I've actually
Okay.
heard someone say that. They walk in to take the test and say, oh, it's computer. Ugh, I'm done.
I'm done.
And in fact, I went to a hearing not too long ago, and the judge told me that he didn't like the product that we have because it's computer based. And if you tell a jury that you have a solution that's known really accurate and it's computer based, they just believe. They believe it works. So
Oh.
story's over. So they don't like that. So voice stress, it's used as a prop. You got fMRI. If you've ever had an MRI, you hurt your shoulder, leg, and you've had one, you know that it's an expensive piece of machinery. It takes a while to do it. You have to have doctors on staff, or at least radiologists and technicians. And you can detect changes in the electricity of the brain. You can do vector maps of the brain, but it's not cost effective. It's not scalable. It's not quick. And you can even use EEGs, electroencephalograms. Have you ever seen someone with all the
Yeah.
touch points, the sensors on the head? You can also, that's been used. They sometimes call that brain mapping, but again, you need expensive equipment, long process, technicians, doctors, just not marketable, not feasible. So when you're talking about doing a lie detector that would work for the masses, it's got to be quick and efficient and really non-invasive. And part of the problem with polygraph is it is invasive. If you've ever had taken a polygraph, the worst part is they put the blood pressure cuff on your arm and they pump it up, and then they ask you questions for about 5 minutes because they need to check your blood pressure while you're answering the questions. And the questions are asked about every 30 seconds. Brings me to a point. If you ever watch Vanity Fair or Jimmy Fallon, or more those late shows where they show someone being polygraphed, driving down the road in a car, and the polygraph examiner's in the back seat, all of that is crap.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you can't ask a question every 3 seconds. That's all theater. You have to ask questions and let the person answer, and then you got to wait 30 seconds. You have to wait because you
I
want the
didn't know
body
that.
to recover from the excited state it may have been in if they were lying. So you got 5 minutes while that blood pressure cuff is pumped up to ask these questions, and by then your fingers are purple and tingly and it hurts. And some people get anxious about pain. I don't
Sure.
know. And so they have to deflate, then chit chat for a bit, let your hand recover, and then a few minutes later, pump it back up again and squeeze the crap out of your arm again, and here you go again. So invasiveness is an issue, and polygraph is invasive. You put sensors around your chest, you put some on your fingers, you put some on your arm, and that is a problem. But polygraph has become the gold standard
Yeah.
because it has a high rate of accuracy. And if it's done well, you can do it in an hour and a half, but still, hour and a half, invasive, accurate, sure. But so along comes a lie detector based on pupil diameter changes and reading behaviors, which is non-invasive. There's nothing attached to the person as they take the test. They sit in front of a computer.
Right.
Everybody nowadays sits in front of screens all day with a phone or computer. So sitting in front of a screen is comfortable.
Yeah.
And you click a mouse to answer the questions. There's no dialogue between you and another person. They can't intimidate you or berate you. So it's a much easier experience, much more comfortable experience. So things are evolving. The only
Well,
challenge is we have so many deep-seated processes and policies and people
Yeah.
tied to the polygraph that it's been difficult.
Well, even now with Verify, which is the newest technology coming out of Converus, it's even less invasive, than even sitting in front of a computer. It can be done in the comfort of your own home rather than going to a facility. And
Yeah. Using an iPhone.
yeah, so high five to Converus for, if ICANN's mission or vision is all about creating access. Let's talk about the opportunity to create access when you're in the comfort of your own home. So,
Yeah, there's a video in 2015. Morgan Freeman hosted a TV program called Into the Wormhole on the Science Channel, and they dedicated one episode to lying and deception and measuring it. And so in 2015, at the very end of the episode, after they had interviewed John Kircher and showed him doing a lab study and showed how this ocular motor technology worked, at the very end, he said, "What would the world be like if we could one day hold up a cell phone in front of someone's face and ask them questions and determine their level of deception? Wouldn't that be cool?" Here we are.
here we
9 years
are.
later. Verify is the product name. It really is based on all the same techniques, research, algorithms that we spent 20 years developing. And now you have iPhone or Android versions of a lie detector that you can hold in your hand.
That are
Powerful.
science based rather than
Yep.
the games that exist in our world. So, okay, a couple more topics, Russ. I feel like I could talk to you, or we could talk to you for hours. There's just so much here. I know
True.
studies have been done. Yeah, studies have been done on combining two different types of lie detection and the impact on accuracy. Would love to talk about that. And I want to we want to dig further into the use of AI in this world. But first, yeah, that's some more recent studies on combining two types of lie detection tech.
It's funny that that concept of using two different tests to measure deception was first postulated in 1955. So
Oh,
not
wow.
recent, but not applicable because you really needed to have two tests that were independent or different. You can't run two polygraphs and call those two independent. You have to run two tests that don't measure the same things. And until iDetect came out with ocular motor deception, you couldn't do much more than two polygraphs, and that doesn't meet the requirement.
Yeah.
So the requirement was if you can run two different tests on the same topic with the same questions, measuring different physiological changes, if a person can pass both of those, mathematically, statistically speaking, you have a 98 to 99% probability that they were telling the truth. Or at the same time, if they fail both, 98 to 99% probability they're lying. And so polygraph has been argued in court in many states, and it's not admissible anywhere, really. State of New Mexico does allow polygraph, but really there are very few. And so going to court with iDetect, and I've gone to 4 different hearings, and my argument isn't, hey, judge, polygraph, hey, we're better than that. You should use iDetect. You should allow iDetect. That's not been the argument because that hasn't worked for 100 years. But no one has gone to court arguing the use of 2 different lie detectors in a successive testing model, which is what we are arguing or discussing, because statistically, mathematically, we won't get into all that stuff, but the science shows that if you can test someone with 2 independent tests on the same topic, same questions, and they pass or they fail, your likelihood of or your probability of getting it right, getting the result right, is almost as good as a DNA test.
Wow.
And
Holy cow.
breathalyzers, which are used all day long in court cases for DWI, DUI cases, are 90 to 95% accurate. And this is more accurate than that. And yet those are admitted all day long as evidence.
Huh.
So our goal now, when we go to court, is to argue that the two things combined are better than the one.
And if you get to that level, right, Russ, if you can say, all right, we're at 95, 98% accuracy, now you're really changing the game in terms of what you can know.
Problem is, when I go to a hearing and I'm questioned by the prosecutor, who has no idea about lie detectors, no idea about technology, is not a
Yeah.
statistician or mathematician, judge, not even close, and you
Right.
get 15 minutes to explain this, it just doesn't happen. And no
Yeah.
judge wants to set the precedent on allowing a lie detector to be used. But iDetect was admitted as evidence in a court case in New Mexico in 2018. I know of cases where iDetect results plus polygraph results have been used in federal cases that didn't go to court, where the judge dismissed the case because someone could pass both and they had no criminal record. But on the books, one case where it was admitted and one case where iDetect was mentioned in the transcripts, because you can search with LexisNexis the words used in court case transcripts. And I found another case in Idaho, US versus Drake 2020. So we're starting to get to that point, but that is the argument. It's a much better argument than iDetect by itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's finish with what you see for the future, Russ. I mean, AI obviously is taking the world by storm right now. There's so much in the news, both people afraid of it, people hopeful for it. What's its impact going to be on lie detection, do you think?
We think that AI is good in terms of, well, two things. We use AI and machine learning, which is not quite AI, but we use those two techniques to improve our algorithms,
Right.
because computers are much faster at analyzing various scenarios all at once. And so when we want to improve our algorithms, we rely on machines to take the data and look at it in a lot of different ways or approaches that a person just can't do. They can do it, probably it take decades, but a computer can do it in hours. And using AI to help write the tests. Writing tests in the case of iDetect is a writing process. Everything is going to be on the screen or being heard, and it has to be written. So we've started to teach courses on how to use AI to write better tests. And at first we thought, whoa, should we let people do that? We want to make sure people know how to write tests and are skilled at it so that they do a good job. And there's nothing to say that you shouldn't be skilled, and you should. There's nothing to say you shouldn't know how to do it, because you should. But I was just teaching a class this week to a police department in another state. And I wanted to show them how it worked. And we wanted to write 5 variations of the same question. So if the question were, I did not rob the bank, I said, let's put that into either ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot. Ask that question and have it give you 5 variations of that statement. And it did. And even though I've written, I told you, 500,000 or more in Spanish and in English, I should have clarified that, because that's even clearer. But even when I did that this week, it came up with one variation that I hadn't used.
Wow.
We get into our patterns of behavior. It's just easier to do the same thing over and over again, but it came up with another way to say it, and I liked it, and it worked. So I asked this group of police officers to help write a test. I wanted them to learn how to do it. And one of them needed to look up the definition of bribery, I think it was. They could have come up with, okay, how many ways can a person bribe? Let's just ask ChatGPT or Google
Yeah.
Gemini or Copilot. So they asked for a definition. It pops in, 10 different ways you can bribe. And so they knew what they wanted, but it just made it faster for them, made it easier. And then they took their knowledge on the suspects that they test and they fine-tuned it, but it got them there faster. It wasn't a substitute. It was an aid in speeding up the process.
It's interesting. I love the way you just said that AI is really going to help us be better in this industry. It's help us write better tests, which is going to increase the accuracy, which is going to make the scoring better. And this is probably one of the great examples of where AI will influence society positively if we can use it well there.
Yeah, and there are 2 types of tests: screening test and diagnostic test. The screening test is one that you'd ask dozens and hundreds of people the same questions, like you might with a pool of applicants. 100 people want the job, and you want to test them to be a police officer. You'd run a screening test against all of them. Conversely, you have one suspect in a bank robbery and you need one test for one person. That's a
Right.
diagnostic test. Diagnostic test, if you're an investigator, that's all you do.
Mm-hmm.
HR people will get a screening test written and they'll have this battery of screening tests they can use and they just run them over and over again. The investigators have to write a new one every day. And there's a
Yeah.
group in Connecticut that does some sex offender testing and they write a fresh new test for each person every time they test them. And so having something to speed up the process is very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Russ, this has been fantastic. We really appreciate your time and your willingness to spend this with us this afternoon. We thank you all for joining us that have joined us. It's great to get your expertise, Russ, on these questions. It's clear that a lot is changing. Thanks, Mary Claire.
Hello, sir. Thank you.
Always good to have you here. And thanks to all of our listeners. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, we hope your quest for truth is successful.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of TruthQuest. If you'd like to be a guest on our show or would like to customize a solution for yourself or your business, email us directly at answers@icanknow.com. TruthQuest is brought to you by the #1 truth verification technology available today. Visit us at icanknow.com to learn more and stay tuned for the next TruthQuest.